Thank you. So let me start with expressing my gratitude. This is an honor and privilege to be here. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Ivona, for such a considerate, kind and generous welcoming. Thank you to all the members and associates of the center for a very, very warm welcome. And thank you to all the audience for joining us here. What I will present today is about exhaustion, scale, and Anthropocene. So the three concepts are crucial to my thinking and to my lecture today. This is a work in progress, so I welcome any suggestions you might have on how to develop what is clear, what is unclear, which links did I miss, which concepts did I overlooked. I'm trying to think Anthropocene ethics through scale, through the concept of scale, and with a phenomenon of exhaustion as a kind of case study here. And I warn you that this presentation, apart from it being a work in progress, is also a kind of rhizome-like presentation in the sense that I'm inviting different concepts and researchers and scholars to think with, to join me here, help me think the three notions in questions. Just briefly, a structure, how I will structure the lecture. First, I will tell a bit about how I understand the term exhaustion. It is, in a way, I do not offer any distinct, strict definition of the term. I rather blur it on purpose because I would like to fathom exhaustion as broad as possible. But I will, in this first part of my lecture, I will concentrate on the work by Byung-Chul Han on the burnt out and palliative societies. And I will concentrate on the fact that, to my understanding and to my interpretation, he misrecognized the scalar aspects of burnt out societies. And I will point also to some work on scale and politics and scale and ethics that help me, let's say, help me build this argument that Han misrecognized the scalar aspects of burnout societies. Then I will move to understanding of scale and why cross-scale research or cross-scale ethics is important to my thinking on Anthropocene ethics. And lastly, I will develop the cross-scale ethics in 3 steps. And here I will also invite a crowd of scholars and concepts to think with. So, exhaustion. Exhaustion, to my mind, is a very apt framing for thinking about the Anthropocene. And I conceive it on several layers, at least those 3. So first of all, what I mean by exhaustion is that ways of thinking, ways of imagining, ways of categorizing are exhausted. We sometimes think about Anthropocene in terms of times of depression, apathy, polycrisis, or dystopian imaginaries. So this is one level. Another, quite obvious, is the exhaustion of human bodies, of human labor, and here the tiredness, the burnt-out society, and the exhaustion is also important. And last but not least, more than human life-death cycles, the exhaustion of more than human lives, of biodiversity, of soils, and so-called resources. So as you can see, this is a very broad understanding of exhaustion. I do not push for a very strict definition. I recognize exhaustion for now as a kind of state when somebody or something reached its threshold of sustainability. And also what is important here is that exhaustion might be conceptualized on different scales. It might be about cells, about the individual organism, about species, about societies, about environmental relations, about economy or politics that is also in a way exhausted, about language and philosophical categories. And the last thing that I find important in exhaustion is that I do not want to conceive of exhaustion as a kind of all-embracing concept, as a kind of dystopic imaginary. I rather see it as potentially offering some kind of cracks, some kind of openings that with which we can overcome the exhaustion, or at least think in new ways in the Anthropocene with exhaustion. We are not doomed to apathy and depression with exhaustion. So, Han. He is in the sense important for me because thanks to his essay, the burnout society, the phenomena of burnout and exhaustion kind of entered the world of philosophy and stimulated a lot of debates and discussions. And just let me briefly sum up what he says about the burnout societies. He diagnoses a kind of turn from the positive, the negative societies, the negative disciplinary societies, and he diagnoses the positive burnout society. He writes that we suffer from excessive positivity. This is this idea that yes, we can, the sky is the limit, we are overachievers, we can achieve everything no matter what costs. So he diagnoses a kind of excess of stimuli, information and impulses that in many ways overwhelms humans' nervous system here and causes burnout. So in a way, achievement subject and depression subjects are companion subjects, and one goes hand in hand with the other. There is hyperactivity on one hand and hyperpassivity on the other, omnipotence and impotence. And as he has it, we are losers in a society of narcissists. And what bothers me in this account, which I find in many ways true, are two things. First of all, and both are connected to scale, I think. First of all, Han, to my mind, oversimplifies and flattens the question of exploitation as solely a matter of self-exploitation. So this is one thing. He kind of concentrates only on an individual level. And the second point is that he fetishizes pain. Let me first briefly talk about self-exploitation. So here you have some quotes from his essay that, in a way, self-exploitation becomes a key word in the essay, right? He, on several occasions, underlines that achievement society is a society of self-exploitation, that exploitation now occurs without domination. That is what makes self-exploitation so efficient. The capitalist system is switching from allo-exploitation to auto-exploitation in order to accelerate. The exploiter is simultaneously the exploited. Perpetrator and victim can no longer be distinguished. Burnout represents the pathological consequence of voluntary self-exploitation. So, in a way, I agree with Hans' insistence on self-exploitation. I think this is important indeed, because it is how one is responding to a kind of coercion, systematic violence and constraint with which one is entangled. But when we solely concentrate on this internality of coercion, we lose from sight one's complicity in broader structural violences, and we lose from sight this seed of agency of transformation possibilities that are completely wiped out of this picture unless we see solution in a kind of individuum-based solutions. But this is only on a level of solutions of individuals. Sorry. So in a way, we lose from sight the whole ethico-political aspects of theorizing what is external coercion, how we are complicit in systemic violence, how we respond to it. Maybe one of the reasons why I have problems with that is that he insists on a very dualistic understanding of external and internal, whereas I think that this account that I offer makes it more nuanced and not understands opposition between external and internal in such opposed and dualistic manners. So in a way, I argue that Hans' approach to exhaustion limits our understanding of it and disenables any form of responsible response. And I hope that the cross-scale ethics project will show how the notion of scale is important when we consider the exploitation and the burnout and the exhaustion. Another problem with Han is that he fetishizes pain, and this is also a question of scale, of what he chooses to be his main purpose and with his main object of research, of analysis. And let's turn now to another essay of his, The Palliative Society, another nickname for contemporaries, where he delivers this account of pain, and he says that in our positive overstimulated societies, we also strive to wipe out all forms of negativity, so suffering and pain are the victims of this positive movement. He later says that societies today do not have the courage to endure pain, and that what we forgot about is that pain purifies, is that pain is a gift. And my problem with that is that he, to my mind, fetishizes pain and suffering, again, concentrating on very privileged Western subject, do not seeing what happens to pain and suffering in a broader picture. So why the Western privileged subject might be indeed released of pain, but where the pain goes, right? So what happens to the pain and the suffering? So to put it in a very everyday categories, of course I can imagine in winter swimming, right? And the pain that is attached to this phenomenon, but only when I have a home where I can eat, drink, rest, where I can warm up, and not when I'm stuck in cold on the border, for example. So this is again the problem of scale, what is the object of our analysis and what we omit from our analysis, most importantly what Hans omits. And let me also briefly mention works that already dealt with the problem of scale and politics and scale and ethics. For example, Max Liboiron talks in length about scale in their book Pollution is Colonialism. What is important about this book is that the author diagnoses a kind of scalar mismatch. So we have a problem that we see on one scale and we offer a solution on completely different scales. And there is this scalar mismatch. We cannot really offer a solution to a problem on different scale if we are dealing with a problem on another scale. So, so there is this importance to diagnose what is the scale of the problem and where and what possible solutions lies on the same scale, right? And in line with this, Liboiron suggests that we as scholars shouldn't concentrate on damaged or hurt bodies because this is a kind of repeating of the violences are already done, the abuse already done, but we should rather search for structural violences. So this is politics, right? In the sense, Han also does this scalar mismatch. So he talks about society, but then concentrates on the individual self-exploitation. And another important scholar that talks about scale in the context of ethics, but also politics, is Rob Nixon. And of course, he talks about slow violence. So I'm again blurring the definition of exhaustion. But I think his analysis can be also used to analyze slow exhaustion, because he talks about the violence that is not event, that is not immediate, that might occur across different scales, that might occur gradually, that oftentimes is out of sight, that might be causing delayed destruction and delayed effects of destruction. And what he struggles to think is how we can take account of this kind of violence, how to think with this kind of violence, and how to ethically respond to this kind of violence if it occurs in many ways beyond our sensory ken. And how, and last but not least, how to do justice to cite Nixon, casualties whose belatedness and dispersal make them resistant to dramatic packaging. As I already mentioned, I think exhaustion might be indeed conceptualized as a form of slow violence, in the sense that it's a gradual process. It is dispersed across scales of time and space. It might not be spectacular. It might not be immediate, but it kind of is, it has this delayed, prolonged destruction. And in the context of exhaustion as slow violence, we may paraphrase Nixon's questions and ask how to take hold of exhaustion as happening across scale, and how to respond or act responsibly toward exhausted bodies' environments, being ourselves complicit in the process of exploitation and self-exploitation, so being made and unmade by them. So having said all this about exhaustion, now I will turn a bit to scale. As I already pointed with Liboiron and Nixon, what is important for me are those ethico-political aspects of scale. So I'm not thinking of scale merely as a methodological tool or epistemological tool that serves as a ladder that we can move and move across different registers of reality to kind of human context. But I mean it also in ethico-political terms. This is tricky because a lot of scholars demonstrate how the concept of scale is naturalized in many ways, and how to put it in Timothy Clark's words, is a kind of grammar whose presence is overlooked in our habitual attention to individual things. But what I mean is scale as a form of politico, ethico, onto-epistemological concept, a kind of apparatus, if you will, that serves to make and unmake bodies' environments. And this is one more quote from Iris van der Toon and Nana Verhoeven, who kind of grasp my intentions. Most obviously, scale is a methodological and epistemological concept, a necessary translation or transcoding of reality, needed for human legibility, actionability, and understanding. At the same time, whatever direction it goes, scale also has fundamental political, ecological, and ethical implications. And scale today appears in many different contexts. I will not do the justice to all the people, unfortunately, that think with scale. But what is important for me in this context is that in the context of climate catastrophe, there appears a kind of collision of scale or derangement of scale, again to use Timothy Clark's words. I mean that the scale or the notions of scale with which we conceptualize the world, like micro, macro, planetary, global, local, are themselves exhausted. The time scales of individual human lifespan and geological deep time are exhausted. There exists kind of research tendency to think about, in a sort of response to these problems, to think about cross-scale approaches. And let me just mention briefly three to illustrate this. The first two examples come from literary studies. The third comes from a critical geography. And so there is a kind of need to move between scales, in order, researchers say, to grasp the full, as much as possible, picture of the Anthropocene. So my first reference is Serpil Opperman, a literary scholar who diagnoses the fact that within debates about Anthropocene, a kind of dominant discussion is about global scale vision. So she suggests that we should also include those close-up perspectives, zoom into the histories of how human and non-human beings, what are their stories in the Anthropocene story. And she suggests that we should do she mentions the cross scale, but also she writes that we should crisscross stories of human and non-human agencies. Another example is also comes from literary studies. This is Timothy Clark, and he offers this kind of interpretation, reading methodology that posits literary text in different scales. And what is important also is that he's not only talking that we should now, with the climate crisis, read all the texts in the scale of planetary, but rather we should again be attentive to what kinds of scales, how texts, what kinds of scales enable us what to see in different literary contexts and different literary texts. So there is also this perspective of kind of jumping scales. And the last example may be most interesting in some ways to my research is Neil Smith. Because he underlines the fact that the scale is produced, and this is a social process. And this is produced to produce further hierarchies. And so he offers a kind of politics of scale, and he also offers the perspective of jumping scales. What is interesting here is that whereas in Opperman and Clark the scale is more or less given, so they are not unpacking the concept of scale, here Smith he uses this term jumping scales, but at the same time by jumping scales we are rethinking the scale and remodeling the concept of scale. So he asks us to kind of rework the concept of scale. And this is what I'm also aiming at, in the sense that I wish to push these cross-scale approaches to an extreme. And this is what I have in mind when I talk about cross-scale ethics. And what I'm aiming at is three questions. How scale is generated, how it is also generative, but also importantly, I use Karen Barat's work and I ask this question following her writing: how can we do analysis that move through the range of scales of injustice, not by pointing out similarities between one place or event and another, but by understanding how those places or events are made through one another. So now I want to move to the cross-scale ethics and to invite you to think with me about it. I chose a quote that I much like and often use and like to think with. This is a quote from Belarusian Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich from her acclaimed book Chernobyl Prayer, Chronicle of the Future, where to my mind she very poetically grasps the problem. And she kind of translates this problem that might sometimes seem abstract to a very existential and very everyday categories. And she also, in a way, offers the perspective that blends together or brings together scales, exhaustion, and the climate catastrophe, and one of its disguises being Chernobyl catastrophe, on different levels: ontological, epistemological, methodological, but also psychological, existential. So let me quote in length. "We would have liked to forget Chernobyl," she writes, "because our minds just wanted to capitulate. It was a cataclysm for our minds. We've ended up living in one world while our minds remain stuck in another. Reality slips away. Our consciousness doesn't have room for it. We can't catch up with reality. We are still using the old concepts of near and far, them and us. But what do near and far actually mean after Chernobyl, when by day 4 the fallout clouds were drifting above Africa and China? The Earth suddenly became so small, no longer the land of Columbus' age. That world was infinite. Now we have a different sense of space. We are living in a space that is bankrupt. What is more, over the last 100 years, people have begun to live longer, yet our lifespan is still tiny compared to the life of the radionuclides that have settled on our land. Many of them will live for thousands of years. We can't dream of even a glimpse of such a distant future. In their presence, you experience a new sense of time. And this is all Chernobyl, its imprint. Everything has changed except us. And so I treat this quote as a kind of invitation to think new ways of thinking, of feeling, of imagining, of entering into relations through rethinking the scale, and with this constant reminder that we are dealing here with a kind of exhausted bodies, landscapes, environments. And also, I treat this quote as an invitation to think how scale is produced, what kinds of bodies and environments scale produces, and also how to think what is entangled, how scale enables us the unpacking of the entanglement of phenomena that seem far away or near, or them or they, but how we can approach this differently. So, these are 3 steps of cross-scale ethics: arts of noticing, scales, unpacking the entanglements, and anthropocentering. So, the first one is arts of noticing. This is a notion that comes from the mindfulness-based techniques and is used by Anna Tsing, an anthropologist, to underline the need to train oneself in noticing the diversity of rhythms of ourselves, of how we are made and how we are unmade, of our bodies, of our worlds, of our environments and relations. And interestingly, as I already mentioned, Han also turns to this kind of meditation-based gardening practices that are kind of offer the kind of healing perspective, but being very much concentrated on the individuum of the world consisting of individual entities, most importantly for them, individual humans. He cannot really rework the human emerging out of this inhuman context. And I think Anna Tsing does it in a way better, because she's more nuancing this concept of the human. So what is important here in the arts of noticing is the fact that we need to kind of unlearn in the first place the rhythms that formed us. So we need to unlearn or try or start to notice what kinds of rhythms formed our bodies and ourselves. And in Western civilization, says Tsing, we were trained to follow one rhythm, one beat, like the rhythm of one heart. And music is, of course, one example, and also Tsing uses this example, but this does not limit to music, because this single perspective relates to far reaching effects, so to progress and profit-oriented organization of human and more than human lives in neoliberal capitalism as scalable endeavor. So by arts of noticing, we are kind of attentive to divergent rhythms, and this also allows us to see how and to what effects we are synchronized, with what we are synchronized. And it enables, I hope, us to find alternative to this unified progress time. So in a sense, it is very little, because this is only arts of noticing, right? This is very humble practice. But in a way, it has this world-changing potential in it, because we may observe what kinds of rhythms in plural we are made of and unmade of in the late capitalism. And of course, talking about rhythms, it is impossible to omit Henri Lefebvre and his work on rhythms and rhythm analysis. Interestingly, he is also mentioned by Barat in Meeting the Universe Halfway as one philosopher or sociologist who insisted on changing the paradigm of space. Space is no longer a kind of container where we put entities and humans and societies, but co-constitutes those humans, those entities, and those societies. So space cannot be isolated. And there are three things that I will illustrate with three quotes that I find inspiring and interesting in Lefebvre's work. The first one is the fact that he really struggles to grasp the plurality of rhythms. So the multitude of rhythms through which different beings are made and unmade. And also the cross-scalar, what is here important, cross-scalar nature of those rhythms. After all, Lefebvre writes that rhythm analyst seeks to grasp the plurality of rhythmic interactions to diverse degrees and levels, from corpuscles to galaxies. So this is a very boundaryless space of rhythms. The second important and fascinating thing about rhythm analysis is the fact that it reformulates this opposition between inside and outside. So rhythm analysts should come to listen to them, to the rhythms, as a whole, and unify them by taking his own rhythms as a reference, by integrating the outside with the inside and vice versa. So there is not really the possibility to stay with this dualism inside and outside and to insist on self-exploitation solely if we are here in a kind of flow between self-exploitation and exploitation. We are made through exploitation, and we are kind of making this exploitation louder in a way by self-exploitation, and this self-exploitation in turn, in reverse, also influence the outside coercion. So there is kind of loops here and not the oppositions. And the third thing that I like about rhythm analysis is that it sees this kind of exhaustion possibility in rhythm. This is only mentioned very briefly in Lefebvre. This is not elaborated in details, but he kind of draws this possibility that polyrhythms or symphonies can fall into morbid and then fatal desynchronization. So there is this possibility of exhaustion of those rhythms and a very dynamic structure. So exhaustion is a kind of rhythm here through which exhausted subjects appear. And it is in itself composed of different rhythms, with outside, inside entangled, and with psychological, anatomical, psychic, but also social rhythms that are made in sync and out of sync with each other. They are very vulnerable in a sense, so to be hacked, so to speak, by rhythms that change, but also can contribute to more thriving or more just worlds, trying to oppose this exhaustive perspective of morbid and then fatal desynchronization. And what I also need to stress is that bringing Tsing and Lefebvre together is, to my mind, a way to also not to point to a kind of rhythm that we should all grasp, that we should all embody, a kind of natural, primordial, pure rhythm of nature that will, maybe now I'm not fair on Han, but something that will kind of return us to a very stabilized, balanced way of life. I rather would like to see it in a more dynamic way, in a more natural, cultural way, that rhythms are contaminated and are heterogeneous, and the way to think with those rhythms is not to purify them, but rather to grasp the potentialities that open in the contaminated rhythms. So that was the first part of the cross-scale ethics. Another one is entanglement, or unpacking entanglement, and this is the notion that I understand following Karen Barat's work. Again, I will not do justice to their full spectrum. I will just mention briefly one aspect of entanglement, which is kind of understanding or getting to understand how places or events are made through one another. So we may ask in today's burnout societies what we see through the notion of entanglement, what rhythms are made and unmade, how life dynamics attunes to market-oriented tempo, to the rhythm of exhaustion, of morbid and fatal desynchronization, and as Lefebvre puts it, or to an unequally distributed catastrophe, as Rob Nixon puts it. And so, just briefly, I return to Alexievich. She grasped this kind of uncanny diverging of human mind and the world. We can't catch up with reality, she writes, a kind of disentanglement, an exploded consciousness, the capitulation of human minds. And Michael Marder, one of the architects of vegetal turn in philosophy, a continental philosopher, takes up this very motif and push it further. So he writes, "It," meaning the radioactive fallout from Chernobyl, will catch up with us before we have a chance to catch up with it, if at all. But for Marder, this out-of-joint experience allows the human to rethink itself and find alliances with the plants. So with the other that for ages was considered to be on the other side of life spectrum. So again, talking about Chernobyl, he writes that we were all plants then. So in a way, he underlines this kind of passivity of both human and plants in the context of catastrophe. And as plants, we could, or he could only penetrate from within the sense of being exposed to radioactivity and more broadly to environmental damage with no escape exit. But this seeming passivity, again, we do not stop here with Marder. Marder wishes to push it even further, and he searches for a kind of activity in this seeming passivity. So he asks, when our consciousness has been exploded, can plants assist us in reconstituting it? And importantly, answering this question, Marder tries to insist on human-plant divide. So he insists on the fact that even if plants can guide us in a sense or be inspirational to us, we need to protect the fact that plant time is not synchronous with human time. And this is what separates, what makes plants and humans different. But it also, to Marder, a way to allow plants to resist the capitalist logic. And what I wish to suggest in response to Marder is that we shouldn't treat it as a separation, but rather as, following Barat, an agential separation. So what I suggest is that it would be maybe helpful to think of plant and human time that they are both synchronous and non-synchronous at the same time. I think that this perspective might enable us to more nuanced understanding of exploitation, of resistance, of flourishing possibilities in late capitalism, and the ambivalence of the allies and relationships between plants and humans. They can be empowering, they can be strengthening, but they can also be murderous and life-threatening. And this was Catriona Sandilans who also convincingly demonstrated that plants as well as humans and non-human animals are all subject to biopolitical regimes in our growing, in our eating, in our thirsting, reproducing, decaying and composting bodies. So in a way, the abused plant is not synchronized to the human, but to the rhythms of capitalist production and alienation, just like the human. And this can be demonstrated with this popular essay by Jonathan Crary, where he shows how 24/7 rhythms of late capitalism influence or synchronize our bodies, our deprived of sleep bodies. So I do not mean to say that plants and human are alike. There are no differences. I also do not mean to say that there are different essential differences. But what I'm aiming at is thinking how those differences are made and to what effects. So when we dig deeper into this entanglement of synchronization and desynchronization, what places, what events, identities, and ways of life are made through one another here. So there is this kind of spectrum that we are dealing with here. Western humans awake in sync with the screen of the mobile phone and the tempo of globalized markets is entangled with how the mobile was produced in the first place, with the minds of cobalt in former colonies, in particular Congo. The burnout human nervous system, the exhausted resources and people in Congo are central to capitalism, entangled with the disciplinary inspiration for 19th century factories that came with plantations, that also brought together humans and plants in mutual alienation and isolation from lively connections, and in exploitation of their corporeal strengths. The organization of work at the plantation was a driving source of later factories and capitalism. This entanglement shows how the disruption of rhythms happens materially across time and geographical scales, produced as different, near-far, but closely entangled. So now in the West, now in Congo, now in the West, then in colonies, all moments entangled together, affecting and exploiting the rhythms of human and plant lives, bringing us on the threshold of resilience. Not yet. Okay. So the third and last point about cross-scale ethics is about anthropocentring. In a way, both arts of noticing and unpacking the entanglement is also a way or an experiment to practice human otherwise, or to decentralize the human. In a way, it opens these questions: with what we can synchronize, to what effects, with what can we desynchronize, and to what effects? What is made as intimate, what is made as distant, to what effects? What is also important to me, one of my reservations towards Han was that he fetishizes pain. And I think that here it's also important to kind of move from damage-centered research, as F. Chuck calls it, to research that opens more possibilities, not concentrating on pain and suffering and damage and hurt bodies. So she writes, the time has come for our communities, and IFTAC is situated in indigenous communities, to refuse to be complicit in our further categorization as only damaged, as only broken. She calls for research that does not fetishize damage, but rather celebrates our survivance. More importantly, damage can no longer be the only way or even the main way that we talk about ourselves. So survivance is more than survival in terms of overwhelming violence, damage and exploitation and exhaustion. It's about resistance and not cultivating the victimhood or the dystopian imaginaries. And before I conclude, I will show you an example of Ukrainian art, very recent. This is a work by Alewtina Kachidze and her project that comments or responds to the full-scale invasion on Ukraine, Russian invasion on Ukraine. And these are poor quality photos, but in a way they are, you will experience what I have experienced seeing those drawings on walls, because they are very delicate, barely visible. So I was also kind of struggling to see what does it say. So Alewtina also turns to plants in times of catastrophe. In this case, this is war. So here you can read, those who did not run away from the war acted like plants. They always have a stable position. But instead of concentrating on or staying with the harm, Kachidze fantasizes about plant-like regeneration possibilities. Here, humans become less resilient, much more vulnerable than plants. She writes here, barely visible, I wish our warriors could regenerate like plants. If I am wounded, I wish I could regenerate the ways plants do. Plants, I'm infinitely jealous of you, she writes. And also, just like Mother, she turns to plants for a kind of to be guided, right? She writes, for example, follow the example of plants. They are pacifist as much as possible on our planet. Or teach me plants to be like you. But if all those measures fail, the plants may serve as witnesses. So here it says, Ukrainians, humans, if you are missing enough evidence about Russian crimes in Ukraine, call us to testify. Trees, lands. So in those fragile, barely visible drawings, exhausted drawings, made in times of Russia full-scale invasion on Ukraine, Kachidze turns to plants to be guided through experience of exhaustion, destruction, and violence, including her own exhaustion of her body, of her fears, and of her well-being. So she fantasizes about this plant-like regeneration, more peaceful world, and the hope for justice with testimonies from plants. And here there are different scales brought together. National, international, global, universal, individual. But the stress is not on pain or harm, so I understand it, but nor is it on overwhelming narrative of dystopic images being realized here and now, but trying to find cracks in the exhausted bodies. As I said, including artist's own body. Trying to find cracks in the exhausted environments, exhausted politics, maybe also exhausted visual language, not in order to find comfort, but in order to find justice. So, summing up, what I was trying to address here is the fact that, to my mind, is important to see exhaustion as something that happens across scale, and also to destabilize the usual scales with which we conceptualize the human, the world, the environment, bodies, their relations. I also wanted to underline how scales are produced, that they are produced, that they are productive, but also that they, for example, produce exhaustion and exhausted bodies environments. And I wanted to ask how scale produces exhaustion, what bodies environments are produced as exhausted through what scales, how bodies environments are made and unmade across scales, and also in many ways psychologically, biologically, socially, individually, collectively, ethically, politically. What I hope is that thinking exhaustion with scale allows to grasp the dynamism that holds together. This is, I think, one of the key words of my presentation, holding together, that holds together self-exploitation and exploitation, violence, damage, and resistance, healing, and renewal. And also, I wanted to stress that the project is also about trying to think how to practice the human otherwise. So at least being attentive to finding rhythms to synchronize with and to desynchronize with. Trying to be attentive to the rhythms that make and unmake us. And also I want to stress that hope is an integral part of this project, in the sense that I think that subjugation goes hand in hand with resistance, sadness and pain, with revival, joy and survivance. And in this vein, I would just leave the last words to Barat when they state, ethico-onto-epistemological questions have to do with responsibility and accountability for the entanglements we help enact and what kinds of commitments we are willing to take on, including commitments to ourselves and who we may become. So it's also about making visible the entanglements we help maintain and erasures that we generate. Thank you so much for your time and attention.